And so our next speaker is Tanya Lombrozo. And so I'm not going to be able to do any justice to this, but I'm going to take a 2-second stab at it. So Tanya did her PhD at Harvard, then went as a junior faculty to Berkeley, and then in 2018-ish, yes, okay, good, moved to Princeton, where she is a professor and the director of the program for cognitive science. Yes,
that was all right.
So I'm remembering so many things here. But here comes all of the impressive parts. Right? Like, you thought that was impressive? No. So I just took, I tried to summarize this, but so she has 163 publications. And so I dare you to go summarize this. Right? So there was 4 edited book volumes, 16 book chapters. Right? Like, it goes on and on and on. She's incredibly prolific on really interesting topics. My favorite being belief, but that's neither here nor there. But she also does communication of science to the broader public. So she does podcasts and writes popular articles for broader consumption, and is all around fabulous. Right? And so I'm incredibly excited to have Tanya here today to talk to us about varieties of beliefs. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me. And this is just a really neat interdisciplinary group. I'm impressed that you've managed to organize it and keep it going for several years and bring this audience together, which I think is an audience I'm excited to get to talk to and to hear your feedback from. So today I'm going to talk about belief. This is a topic of long-standing interest in philosophy, psychology, other social sciences. And I think part of the reason why it's been so central to so many of these disciplines is because we take belief to be really central to who we are, to how we reason, and to how we behave. And this is true from 2 different kinds of perspectives that most of us in this room have probably adopted. One is the perspective of something like a scientist or scientific psychologists that appeal to belief in our scientific theories of human behavior. So in fact, if you look at a lot of phenomena that psychologists talk about, we talk about things like belief polarization and belief bias and placebo effects and other kinds of cases where we posit beliefs as a scientific kind to do important explanatory work in explaining features of human behavior and reasoning. But we also do this within our folk psychology or theory of mind. Just as everyday people going around the world, beliefs play a really important role in how it is that we predict and explain other people's behavior. Despite the centrality of belief to both of these enterprises, there are lots and lots of puzzles about belief that I think pervade the literatures in both philosophy and in psychology. And I think this is true even if you restrict yourself to the kinds of beliefs I'm going to be talking about today, which are the sorts of beliefs that are introspectively accessible to us, that we can explicitly share with each other in linguistic form, and so on. So even within that kind of already potentially restricted set of beliefs, it seems like we face questions like, how do beliefs respond to evidence? You know, if you look at the psychology literature, in some cases you find that people seem to be optimal Bayesian reasoners, and in other cases you find that they are totally insensitive to opposing data. Are beliefs under voluntary control? This is a literature that has its roots in philosophy, where you get more people arguing that we can't just choose to believe whatever we like, but you do also get alternative perspectives, and in psychology there's a relevant literature as well. How do we think about belief strength? I mean, there's sort of one notion of belief confidence or strength that maps onto something like subjective probability, but there's all these other notions of belief strength too, like for example, what's maybe more central to your web of beliefs or what's more important to your identity and so on. And so these are all ongoing topics of discussion, and there's many more that I'm sure you could all add to this list. What I want to do in the talk today is suggest that maybe we can get some clarity or insight for some of these by exploring the hypothesis that there's more than one kind of belief, right? Maybe part of the reason why we see this sort of heterogeneity across all these cases is that we're not really trying to characterize just one clearly defined phenomenon. Maybe there's kind of a cluster, maybe there's more than one. And this is not a new idea. Many people have argued for many versions of this idea. I just have a small subset of references here. There's again many more that you could add. The specific flavor of this idea that I'm going to argue for is that it's useful to distinguish between what I'm going to call epistemic beliefs and non-epistemic beliefs. And I will say more about what I mean, but to give you the first kind of for intuition. Epistemic beliefs are basically beliefs with the function of tracking what's out there in the world. They're our best guesses about what's most likely to be true. And non-epistemic beliefs are the ones that play lots of other social, emotional, and other kinds of roles. So in part one of this talk, I'm going to motivate and refine this hypothesis a little bit further to give you a sense of the version of this idea that I want to explore. I'll then present some of the evidence that we have, and then depending on time, I may or may not get to some newer evidence and sort of at least hint at some of the further directions we're hoping to explore. Okay, so first let me motivate and refine this hypothesis. So I'm going to start out with what I take to be two pretty uncontroversial premises, just to sort of get you in the space that I'm thinking about. Those are that our beliefs play a variety of psychological roles, and that these psychological roles can compete in the sense that the best belief for one of these roles might not be the best belief for another one of these roles. I'm then going to argue for what I take to be a more controversial hypothesis for how we address this kind of conflict, and that is that cognition handles this challenge through flexibility in cognitive attitudes, sort of different flavors of believing that better align with these different goals. And since we do have an interdisciplinary audience, I want to flag here that what I mean by cognitive attitude here is kind of what philosophers mean by cognitive attitude. It's the relationship you have to some sort of propositional content, say. I don't mean what social psychologists mean when they use the term attitude, which is usually something more like an evaluation or a valenced belief toward something. All right. So let's start with the uncontroversial hypotheses, because this part's easy, and hopefully you'll come along with me for these. All right. So beliefs play a variety of psychological roles. So one thing that our beliefs do is give us something like our best guess of what the world is like for the purposes of supporting accurate predictions, guiding our behaviors that depend on the truth of our beliefs, and so on. And I'm going to refer to this kind of role for beliefs as broadly epistemic. I call it epistemic plus there because I think there's some extra stuff in there beyond just tracking what's true. Like probably we want to track useful truths, not just sort of like all truths indiscriminately. But broadly, the thought is that these sorts of beliefs play a truth tracking kind of role. There's other things we do with our beliefs too. We might use them to feel better about ourselves and motivate ourselves to action. We can use them to signal our commitment to other people. We can use them to indicate our values, what kind of person we are, what we consider to be important, and so on. I think this is actually a very heterogeneous class of roles for belief, and I'm going to refer to it as broadly non-epistemic. And this is kind of meant to be everything else that's not the truth-tracking function of beliefs: the social, the moral, the emotional, the motivational, and so on. And I'm very open to the possibility that this is a heterogeneous category that we're going to want to further subdivide. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to treat these all together as one alternative to the kind of epistemic notion of belief. Okay, these can compete. What do I mean by this? Some of you probably have questions, and one of you could be thinking to yourself, oh, the question I have, that's the best question. And that might be a very good non-epistemic belief for you to have, because it might be the sort of belief that actually motivates you to ask the question, right? Maybe if you didn't have this view that your question is the best question, it'd be really hard for you to raise your hand, confidently ask it, feel good about yourself doing so, and so on. So this has, there's a lot of good stuff here. But it may or may not be the most epistemically supported belief, right? Maybe if you actually evaluated all the evidence available to you, you'd arrive at a different belief, like my question is just below average. Okay, very mundane example, but this is just meant to show there could be a competition. In this case, and in many more important higher stakes cases, kind of the best belief from the purposes of certain kinds of non-epistemic goals, like motivating yourself, feeling good about yourself, and so on, might be different from the best belief along these sort of strictly epistemic dimensions. Okay, so far, as I said, I think this is pretty uncontroversial, and I think the standard view that a lot of people have to accommodate the facts I've described so far are to adopt a kind of pluralism about the causal influences on belief. So the thought is that the beliefs that we actually end up with are going to be some complicated function of both these epistemic and these non-epistemic kinds of considerations. So for example, a very common view in psychology might be that in a lot of ways our beliefs are constrained by evidence, but they're also subject to lots of processes of motivated reasoning. And that's going to be one of the mechanisms by which these non-epistemic things ultimately influence what we believe by, for example, changing which evidence we expose ourselves to, changing how we interpret that evidence, and so on. So I take this kind of pluralism, which is a pluralism about causal influences on beliefs, to also be pretty uncontroversial. What I want to suggest is not necessarily an alternative to that. I'm very sympathetic to the pluralism about causal influences, but maybe an additional way to think about these cases that make some different predictions, and that's a kind of pluralism about cognitive attitudes. Okay, so here's this term that I'm borrowing from the way philosophers talk about this. Just to get you in the right space of what I'm thinking about, I want to give you an example contrasting two different attitudes. So for example, let's say that Q is some proposition, like perhaps you have certain predictions or hopes about the next election. You could predict that Q for whatever your Q is, some proposition, or you could hope that Q. Okay, now for those two cases, the content is the same. In both cases, I'm stipulating that it's Q. But it's quite different to predict that Q versus to hope that Q, right? So like different sorts of inputs are going to change whether or not you predict something versus hope that it's true, and whether or not you predict it versus hope that it's true is going to have different kinds of consequences for how it affects your behavior. So the difference between predicting and hoping is a difference in attitude towards Q. And so the hypothesis I want to explore is that there might be a similar kind of difference in attitude that is both subsumed under the typical word belief, where there's a kind of more epistemic flavor of believing and a more non-epistemic flavor of believing, where these are different kinds of cognitive attitudes. All right, so that's a specific form of pluralism that I want to explore, and I take this to be, at this point, a controversial claim. I think this is not the way that psychologists and typically philosophers think about the way to accommodate the fact that we do have both epistemic and non-epistemic influences on belief. Okay. So there's two versions of this question that we could ask. One is a question about distinct psychological kinds, right? So we could kind of, with our scientific psychology hats on, ask, are there two different kinds of believing, the epistemic flavor and the non-epistemic flavor? And we can also ask this as a question about folk psychology or theory of mind. Is it the case that when we go about the world attributing beliefs to other people, reasoning about their beliefs, drawing inferences about their behavior, and so on, that we are systematically tracking and differentiating something like epistemic versus non-epistemic flavors of believing? All the evidence that I'm going to show you today addresses this second question. It's kind of the folk psychological question, because I'm going to be looking at people's explicit judgments about beliefs and what kinds of inferences they draw from beliefs. But I take it to be indirect evidence for this first question, right? So if it is the case that people are systematically tracking this in the way that they attribute beliefs and draw inferences about beliefs, one explanation for why that might be is because maybe human cognition is such that these are two distinct psychological kinds, and that's why it's useful for us to track them. But I do take it to be indirect evidence, and I'm not going to really get to any direct evidence for that claim. Okay, so that's the hypothesis. We get to the evidence. I do want to acknowledge my collaborators on the first part of the work I'm going to talk about. A lot of this comes from a paper that was recently published where the first author was Alejandro Vesga, who's actually a philosopher. He was a postdoc in my lab, and he's now a faculty member at the University of Texas at Houston, and Neil Van Leeuwen, who's also a philosopher. I also wanted to flag that Neil and I are editing an Oxford handbook of the cognitive science of belief. It is about to go to the editors for copy editing, which is really exciting because it has been like many years in the making, and in fact some of the people in this room have contributed. But that will be a combination of philosophers and psychologists writing about belief. We have 35 different entries and various kinds of reflections and synthesis pieces, and so I'm really excited about it. So for those of you interested in this topic, keep an eye out for it. Okay, evidence. All right, so our goal with this evidence is to demonstrate that people systematically differentiate beliefs that are held with these epistemic versus these non-epistemic cognitive attitudes. All right, that's our goal. There's a few challenges. So how are we going to go about doing this? The strategy that we adopted is to try to identify signatures that plausibly differentiate these two belief types. And then we can see whether or not we get these systematic differentiation using these signatures of these beliefs. And there's three I'm going to talk about, which I will motivate in a couple of slides. Second challenge is that this is supposed to be a hypothesis about a difference in cognitive attitudes, right? So it matters that if we find differences between beliefs, it's tracking the attitude and not something else. And so what we want to do is make sure that we either hold fixed or control for differences in belief contents or something like belief strength. right? Otherwise, if we found differences between these beliefs and these beliefs, it could be because they're about different things, and it really reflects a difference in content, not a difference in cognitive attitude. Okay, so let me tell you more about the signatures, because this is going to be what really sort of motivates the predictions and the way we actually test the difference across our types of beliefs. For each of these, I'm going to give you the rationale for a prediction, and then try to give you an intuition pump to see if I can at all elicit the relevant intuitions in you before then showing you the data from our participants. Okay, so the first posited signature to differentiate these more epistemic versus non-epistemic beliefs is whether or not people find it natural to describe those beliefs in a kind of probabilistic or graded way. So in philosophy, there are debates about the relationship between so-called like full belief or all-out belief, where you think about belief as kind of a state that you either are in or you're not in. You either maybe believe or disbelieve, or believe or suspend or disbelieve, and so on. And credences, which are something more like subjective probabilities. And in psychology, you also see that sometimes we talk about beliefs as something that is naturally expressed as a subjective probability or a degree of confidence, and other times we elicit people's beliefs or talk about beliefs as if it's sort of more all or none, right? You either have a belief or you don't. So the thought here is that it might be more natural to describe epistemic beliefs in these graded or probabilistic ways. Why would we think this? One reason is that epistemic beliefs should be proportional to evidence. And evidence is the sort of thing that comes in gradations. We can have weak evidence for a belief, we can have strong evidence for a belief. If our beliefs are tracking evidence, it seems like we're losing a lot of information if we don't have some sort of correspondingly graded notion to go with how we think about beliefs. You might also think that epistemic beliefs should respond to new evidence in ways that track the truth, right? So they should be the sorts of things that are amenable to a procedure for belief updating, such as Bayesian inference, right? So you get some new piece of evidence, you have to adjust your belief. It seems like you should adjust it some amount that corresponds to the amount of evidence that you've got. And so again, that seems to push you to something like a graded or probabilistic representation of belief. Okay, so these are kind of theoretical reasons to think that beliefs that have the function of tracking the truth ought to have this kind of natural graded or probabilistic control. On the other hand, for at least some of our beliefs that play these more non-epistemic roles, you might think it's actually a liability to build in something like uncertainty, right? So if I want to communicate to you that I'm really all in on our shared cause, I'm really all in on our shared social identity, that you can trust me for some sort of cooperative enterprise, you might think that actually it's better for me to give you a unqualified belief rather than to indicate my uncertainty or the fact that I could be wrong by giving you some notion of uncertainty or graded belief. Okay, so here is the intuition pump. We'll see if this works or not. It's similar to how our studies go, as you'll see when I get to the studies. Okay, I want you to imagine two people. Sorry for the low contrast there on this screen. I want you to imagine two people who both hold a belief in the same content. The content is that Bill is innocent. All right, so Bill is somebody who's been accused of a crime. Both of these characters believe that Bill is innocent. The first character believes that Bill is innocent based on the balance of evidence. They've looked at all of the evidence, they've evaluated it, they think Bill is innocent. In fact, they would say that there's an 82% chance that Bill is innocent. Okay, so there I gave you the belief attribution, and then I recast it in probabilistic terms, and hopefully that seemed totally natural. All right, now let's consider the bottom case. This bottom character believes that Bill is innocent. This person believes that Bill is innocent out of loyalty. They feel like Bill is someone who maybe belongs to their political party, and so it would feel wrong to accuse Bill of a crime. So out of loyalty, this person believes that Bill is innocent. In fact, they'd say there's a 95% chance that Bill is innocent. Okay, don't know if this worked or not, but what hopefully you maybe got was the feeling that it's a little weird to recast the belief that's based on loyalty in probabilistic terms. And maybe not, like maybe you think 95 is like not high enough. Make it 99.9. Like the point is, it doesn't really matter what the number is. It seems a little strange for that sort of a belief to be recast probabilistically. Like maybe it doesn't feel like the sort of thing that is natural to describe in probabilistic terms. Okay, I can't tell from expressions if that worked or not, but that's kind of the intuition going on. Okay. Thank you for the one person who nodded. Okay, here's the second signature that we're going to look for. This is what we call non-directional versus directional control over belief. And it's motivated by the literature on doxastic voluntary control over belief. So some people argue that for conceptual reasons and empirical reasons too, we can't have direct control over our beliefs, because if we could just control whatever we believe, that would threaten the epistemic role of the right? If we want beliefs to be our best guesses of what the world is like, they ought to be constrained by evidence. If I can just decide to totally overwrite that evidence because it would make me feel better to think that different political facts are true, for example, then it seems like we would be subject to all of these distorting influences that would threaten the epistemic function of belief. So the thought is that if your motivation is epistemic, I mean, you might be motivated to have accurate beliefs, that might affect behaviors like how much evidence you seek or how much thought you put into something. But an epistemic motivation shouldn't control the actual conclusion you arrive at, right? You can control like whether you deliberate, but an epistemic goal shouldn't give you a directional motive to arrive at a particular conclusion. So here's the intuition pump. It's kind of subtle. See if it works. Again, we have these same two characters. Again, they've arrived at the belief that Bill is innocent. The one on the top has done so based on evidence for epistemic reasons. The one on the bottom has done so out of loyalty. This is largely a non-epistemic belief for that person. And now we ask our participants to basically determine whether or not it's natural to describe the kind of control this person had over their belief as being directional or non-directional. And the non-directional version would be that you might think that this character decided whether to believe that Bill is innocent, but you shouldn't agree that they decided to believe that Bill is innocent. Again, I'm sorry for the low contrast, I hope you can read that. So it's a pretty subtle distinction, right? So we're sort of asking, how would you characterize how this person came to their belief? They decided whether to believe that P, or they decided to believe that P. Okay, so in both cases, we're actually attributing some amount of control over their belief. That sounds weird to some people. Our participants seem to be okay with it. But the difference is whether it's kind of directional or non-directional. All right, the third signature, this is the only one that's not motivated from kind of more theoretical considerations. It really is just motivated by prior empirical work. So there's been some prior empirical work that looks at the uses of the term think versus believe as attitude terms towards a proposition. And these studies have done this in a few different ways. One thing they've done is look at corpus analyses and when people use think versus believe. And one of those things, the thing that's emerged from that is that believe is much more likely than think to appear for kind of religious or ideological content. So you can sort of think about your own intuitions here. Somebody might believe that ghosts exist as opposed to think that ghosts exist. Both of these are reasonable grammatical constructions that you can make in English, but maybe it feels a little bit more natural to have believe when it's this kind of like supernatural, religious or ideological content. On the other hand, I think this is red, not I believe this is red, when it's kind of a something factual or mundane. So these studies have found these sorts of think-believe differences in these corpus studies and experimental studies as well. And it's been replicated in 4 other languages besides English. So it does not seem to just be a feature of English that we have these 2 particular attitude terms that have these associations. This is true at least in a handful of other languages and cultural contexts where this has been tested. This work has been used to argue for a slightly different but related distinction, something more like a difference between kind of like a religious credence and a kind of more factual or mundane belief. But the thought is that really maybe this is tracking something more like epistemic versus non-epistemic belief, where my category of non-epistemic is a little bit broader than what the previous data has looked at, which is overwhelmingly religious. Okay, so here's an intuition pump, and this actually just comes from this previous data. So most of these studies have not controlled for content. And what I mean by that is that when you do these corpus analyses, what you see is that people say, give, think versus believe with different contents. But there's one really nice study in this prior work where they did control for content. And so we'll see if you get the intuitions here. So now we have these 2 characters. Both of them have the belief that Advil is not a cure for headaches. But participants received different sorts of vignettes to set this up as either a more evidence-based epistemic belief or a more kind of religious faith kind of belief. So in the top case, Carrie is someone who occasionally gets headaches. When Carrie's had headaches in the past, she's taken Advil and it doesn't seem to do anything for her. As a result of these experiences, Carrie blanks that Advil is not a cure for her headaches. And people will fill in thinks versus believes. So you can consult your own intuitions. Hopefully that worked. Things seems very natural there. Okay. Terry, on the other hand, grew up in a very religious community, and her religious community believes that the way that you address illness and disease and pain and so on is not through medical interventions, but through prayer. And so when she has a headache, she will refuse Advil because Terry blanks that Advil is not a cure for headaches. Hopefully you get the intuition that beliefs seems more appropriate in the second case than in the first case. And what's really nice about these examples here is that the content is held fixed, right? So in both cases, it's a belief of the same content. Nonetheless, people are systematically choosing these different attitude terms. And so based on this prior research, we thought this might be a third signature that differentiates these more epistemic versus non-epistemic kinds of beliefs. All right, so that's the background. Now I can go through the data really quickly because you understand the motivation for it. But here's basically how we investigated the signatures. The idea is that we're going to give people a vignette that sets up a belief of the particular content as either an epistemic belief or a non-epistemic belief. What we're going to do over here is suggest that it's based on evidence, it's responsive to new evidence, and it aims at truth, right? Sort of like canonical characteristics of something that has a truth tracking function. The non-epistemic beliefs, our stimuli vary a lot in what the non-epistemic considerations are, but they all involve something that's based on a non-epistemic consideration like loyalty or faith or wanting to motivate yourself to some action. They would be at least hard to change in the face of contrary evidence, and that aims at some non-epistemic value like supporting a friendship, for example. Then we can ask people to basically tell us which of these poles of our signatures seems more natural for that case, with a prediction that we should get the epistemic poles of these signatures for the epistemic case and the others for the non-epistemic case. So that's the basic logic. So here's just one example of our vignettes. So as I said, we had several vignettes and we varied what the non-epistemic themes were, but I think it's helpful to see what an actual example looked like. All right, so in this case we have Adam. So Adam and John were best friends in their childhood and teenage years. However, after graduating from high school, John left to serve in Water Without Borders, a humanitarian program based in the Global South. 10 years later, after traveling the world with the organization, John comes back to his hometown and rebuilds his friendship with Adam, who never left. But one day, Adam hears a rumor that John came back because he was stealing money from the organization he was working for. Okay, so this is all the same for the epistemic and the non-epistemic, and then here's where it diverges. So in the epistemic case, Adam has trouble accepting this because it doesn't fit with what he knows about John. If Adam were presented with strong evidence, he would fully accept John's guilt. Ultimately, what's important to Adam is to accept whatever is true, but based on the evidence he has, Adam currently blanks that John did not steal money from the organization he was working for. Okay, so you can see it's basically it's an evidence-based belief that aims at truth and would respond to new evidence. All right, okay. Here's the non-epistemic case. Adam has trouble accepting this because he wants to be a loyal friend to John. Even if Adam were presented with strong evidence, he would have trouble accepting John's guilt. It would feel like wronging John. What's important to Adam is nurturing his friendship with John, and he wouldn't want to betray that. Given these feelings, Adam currently blanks that John did not steal money from the organization he was working for. Okay, so hopefully you can see how that satisfies the kind of non-epistemic cases. Okay, so first signature. Do you think it's natural to describe John's belief as corresponding to some probability? For example, John believes that there's an X% chance that Adam did not steal money from the organization, and people basically say no, he just believes it, or yes, it's natural to describe it as corresponding to some probability. So they're not even telling us what the probability is, right? The judgment is sort of like, is it natural to think about this in probabilistic terms? So here's what we get. You have the proportions of participants who gave the binary response, which is that he simply believes this as opposed to not believing it, is in red there, and the yellow is how many think the probabilistic construal is natural. Overall, people think the binary construal is much more natural, and we find this kind of consistently across other versions of these kinds of measures that we've used, but you do see a significant difference across our conditions in the predicted direction, where people are more likely to give that binary classification in the non-epistemic case than in the epistemic case. We also, even though here people don't assign a probability, after the study, we force everybody to assign a probability to this belief. And that actually, in this case, doesn't differ across conditions. And that's important because we wouldn't want it to be the case that we get a difference because, for example, people just think the belief based on loyalty is stronger or something like that. So in all of our studies, we in fact measure that. In a lot of them we don't find differences, but when we do find differences, we control for it. And so everything I'm going to show you is a difference that persists on top of whatever differences there might be in something like degree of belief or confidence. Okay, second signature is this non-directional versus directional belief. So which of the following is a better description of what happened? John decided to believe that cue, or John decided whether to believe that cue. I think this is pretty subtle, so I was actually really happy that this worked at all, but it works. In the same way as for the binary belief, we find that overall people have a preference towards the directional version of the claim, but you do see a significant difference across conditions in the predicted direction. And third signature, think versus believe. So this actually happened first. So when they first had that statement at the end of the passage, there was a blank that they filled in with thinks versus believes. So we asked them what the more natural ways of completing the blank. And again, we find the same sorts of results. Overall, a preference towards believe for our stimuli, but a significant difference in the predicted direction. So if I show you all three of these signatures together, you see a really consistent pattern. So overall, we're finding preferences for what we consider to be the non-epistemic kinds of indicators, right? So people seem to think that binary, directional control, and believes are more natural for our stimuli, but for all three of them, we find differences in the predicted directions. And my speculation on why we're getting the higher baseline for the non-epistemic profile is that it's partially an artifact of our stimulus materials. So for all of our cases, we had to come up with propositions that could work for either an epistemic framing or a non-epistemic framing. And that means that we're not looking at like extremely mundane factual kinds of beliefs like, I think this is red, or today is Tuesday, or the atomic number of gold is 79, things like that, right? And so I suspect part of it reflects that, and then if we were to look at those more kind of canonical epistemic beliefs that are harder to construe in any other way, we would probably see more movement along the whole scale. But so far, that's mostly an empirical question. The data that are out there is for think versus believe. You do find people along the whole sort of more dramatic differences when you confound content and other things, those differences as well. Okay, so what I've shown you so far is study 1 here, which has the structure where you get an epistemic or non-epistemic vignette to set up a particular kind of functional role for belief, and then we elicit these three signatures. In study 2, we look at exactly the reverse. The thought is, if we give people one of these three signatures, can we find that they make the reverse inference from the signature to whether or not the belief is playing a more epistemic or non-epistemic role? So here's what that looked like. So here's our cover story. Alex and Blaine were both called by the same survey company. The survey company asked them several questions. One question concerned their take on weather claim. And we have several different claims. I'll give you some examples. And here's what they each said. Okay, so now this is between subjects. So some participants see that Alex just asserts claim, and that Blaine says there's a 98% chance of that claim. Okay, so the thought is they both believe it, but in one case it's a binary belief, in one case it's a probabilistic belief. Different group of subjects guess the directional versus non-directional control. So the top character says, I decided to believe claim. The bottom one says, I decided whether to believe claim. And the third is think versus believe. So one character says believe, and the other character says think. Here's the claims that we used. Again, what we were going for with these is something that we thought could plausibly be either epistemic or non-epistemic. What we want to do is push that around by using the signatures. And we also just wanted them to be heterogeneous in other ways, right? Like not all of them religious, for example. But you can see that there's a range there. And then we're going to ask people whether or not, which of these characters they think shows this epistemic profile, and which they think shows this non-epistemic profile. Okay, so here's what that looks like. So they're told that, one of the two people, Alex or Blaine, was much more concerned with the evidence in arriving at this belief. Who do you think is the person who was most interested in basing their view on the evidence? And then they answered from definitely Alex to definitely Blaine. Okay, I'm going to show you the data, not in terms of Alex and Blaine, because we don't care about that, right? What we care about is who's showing each signature for belief. And so the way I'm showing it here is you can see the mean rating on this scale, but mapped from the character who gave the binary response to probabilistic, from directional to non-directional, and from believes to thinks. All of these bottom lines are kind of the non-epistemic profile, and up here is the epistemic profile. And what you can see is that participants think the character who showed the epistemic kind of signature for each of these distinctions was thought to be the one more likely to be interested in evidence. This is about changing in response to new evidence. So who do you think is the person who's more likely to change their mind if they were presented with evidence indicating that it's not the case, that claim? And again, we find the same pattern across all three signatures, where participants are more likely to think the character who gave the epistemic signature is the one who's more likely to be responsive to new evidence. And finally, who do you think is the person who's more interested in having true and accurate beliefs about the world? And again, same pattern of results. Participants reliably think the character who gave the more epistemic signature is the one who's more likely to be aiming at truth. So again, across all of these, we see very consistent profile for all three signatures. People seem to be able to make this reverse inference from the signature to whether or not a belief is playing a more epistemic or non-epistemic kind of functional role. All right, final study. We ended at 12:15, right? And I want to leave time for questions. Okay. Okay, the final thought was to look at whether or not people use this kind of information to make inferences about people's behavior or actions. Right? If you think about theory of mind, it's canonically posited to explain and predict people's behavior. And so we wanted to take a step towards behavior prediction in this final study. And so it follows a very similar structure to study 2. So in study 2, we sort of give people a signature and then see what inferences they draw about the belief's kind of epistemic profile. In study 3, we again give them the signatures in the same way, but now we want people to make predictions about what sorts of behaviors that people might exhibit. And the distinction that we were looking at was between what we call truth-dependent and symbolic behaviors. And I'll spell that out with an example in the next slide. So this is again the same sort of structure you saw before. People get this cover story about these two characters. They get just one of the three signatures that differentiates the epistemic or non-epistemic beliefs. And now we say that sometime later, one of the two of them did the following, some particular action. And participants are asked to tell us who they think is more likely to have performed this behavior. And we came up with behaviors that were either what we called truth-dependent or symbolic. The idea behind a truth-dependent action is that the success of that action depends on the truth of the proposition that it's based on. So for example, suppose the claim is that there's alien life on our galaxy, and that what the person does is anonymously donate $1,000 to a scientific organization that investigates how to combat potential threats to humans from alien life on Earth. The thought is that that action makes a lot of sense, it's successful, if this claim is true. But if this claim is false, this probably doesn't get you a whole lot, right? Like you lose money, you don't get any social status because it's anonymous, and so on. Contrast that with the claim over there, which we call the symbolic action. So in this case, the person spends lots of personal savings to create billboards with a large photo of themselves with a thumbs up next to the slogan, "Welcome aliens." Okay, so does the success of that action depend on the truth of there being aliens? I mean, maybe a little bit, but probably they're trying to do some other stuff with it too. Like they're trying to say like, hey, I'm an alien person, come to my alien parties. So for a lot of whatever their like other kind of social or identity goals are, it probably doesn't hinge so much on the truth of that claim. I do want to say I think there's kind of a difference in degree here rather than kind, right? Like there's going to be some messiness here, but we're trying to get here on this end things that are truth dependent and things over there that are symbolic, where the success of the action is not so dependent on the truth of the claim. So hopefully that distinction makes sense. Okay, so participants are told that, as I said, sometime later one of these two characters does this. And again, I'm plotting, okay, so here I'm plotting things for each of these signatures. So for example, binary versus probabilistic. We have binary down here and probabilistic up here. Directional versus non-directional, believe versus think. And you can see what people thought for the symbolic action versus the truth-dependent action. So the first thing to point out is everything's on the bottom. People just thought the characters who were on the non-epistemic end were just more likely to act overall. And I think that's because in this study, we did find differences in confidence. People think those people just hold their beliefs more strongly. But the critical difference for our predictions is that the truth-dependent action should take a step up towards the epistemic goals for all three of these signatures. And so despite the overall preference to think that it's the non-epistemic person who will act, you see a systematic difference across all three signatures where there's a step towards the epistemic character for the truth-dependent action. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so interim summary, and then I'm just going to like gesture at something newer because it's cool and exciting new stuff, but I want to leave time for discussion. Okay, so I've argued that beliefs play a variety of psychological roles, that these roles can compete, such that the best belief for one might not be the best belief for another. One hypothesis is that one of the ways that human cognition handles this kind of tension is by having a kind of pluralism or flexibility in cognitive attitudes. And in particular, we might have different flavors of believing. One flavor of believing might be this more epistemic flavor of believing, and then maybe we have one or even more than one that's kind of more tuned towards these non-epistemic flavors of believing. And the evidence I've shown you is that people systematically differentiate these epistemic and non-epistemic cognitive attitudes in at least 3 ways. So we have the binary probabilistic signature, the directional versus non-directional control, and think versus believe. And importantly, for our claim that this is a difference in cognitive attitudes, it really matters that we find these differences while controlling for belief contents and controlling for something like subjective probability or belief strength. I have people in asterisks here because I should have said this earlier. All of our participants were US-based participants with the data collected online. We have not yet done this in other kinds of cultural contexts. We have not done this developmentally. We need to do all of the things we saw from the previous talk to figure out whether or not we can generalize more broadly. So far, the only thing in the vicinity that has been done cross-culturally is finding that think versus believe difference in a handful of other languages, but not with our stimuli, with the original stimuli from those papers. So my bet is that this will generalize, but I do not have the data to back that up. Okay, so zooming out to this broader hypothesis, there's a bunch of further directions to explore. Here are some of the ones that I'm thinking about, and some of them we've started to pursue. So one is, what are some additional signatures of belief type? I showed you 3. Those aren't exhaustive. Those are just the first 3 we came up with. What might some others be? All of these involve these third-person judgments about another person's belief. And so one thing we've started to do is look at how people classify their own beliefs. And one thing that's nice is that I'm hoping that when we do that, we can move away from these third-person judgments to first-person judgments and their relationship to behavior. So for example, if people can meaningfully classify their own beliefs in these terms, choosing think versus believe, probabilistic versus non-probabilistic controls, and so on, how does that relate to their actual belief revision behavior, for example, or to whether or not they seek out contradictory evidence, and so on? So those are questions I'd really love to explore. This is still all in the realm of folk psychology, what I showed you, right? These are explicit judgments about belief. It'd be nice to take a move towards actual beliefs as a psychological kind. And finally, my kind of considered theoretical view is not that there are 2 kinds of beliefs with really clear boundaries between them. I think it's going to be a messier story, unfortunately, where there might be multiple important dimensions of belief space, with any particular belief occupying a point in this space. And so I think we want to begin to explore that. So I'm just going to gesture at one of the things we're doing in this first bullet here, in part because I'm super excited about this work, and in part because it's being led by Joseph Sommer, who is right there. So Joseph did his PhD here, but is now a postdoc in my lab. And we've been doing several projects that have to do with the role of consistency in belief. And this is actually not even my favorite. You'll have to ask him to hear about my favorite. But it's the one that follows from this line here. And this is also with an undergraduate at Princeton named Haruka, who's done a great job contributing to this. And what we were interested in here was how people evaluate inconsistency in other people's beliefs. So for example, if you look at this poll here, I'm not sure you can read that. You'll have to do my work to try to read that. All right, but this asked Americans what they think about Trump's conflict with the courts. And what you can see here is that 68% of Republicans in this poll indicated that the president should obey federal court rulings even if he disagrees with them. But at the same time, 78% of Republicans indicated that Trump should keep deporting people despite a court order to stop. Okay, so at least some of those people are seemingly being inconsistent. And one of the things that we might wonder about is whether or not something like a norm for holding consistent beliefs operates equally across all types of beliefs. If your beliefs are serving a truth tracking function, you might be very concerned by holding inconsistent beliefs. But if your beliefs are doing something else, perhaps consistency norms don't operate in quite the same way. And so one of the things we've done in these studies is present people with vignettes that involve a character who has inconsistent beliefs that can vary across lots of different kinds of domains. And one of the things we ask them is if it would be rational for someone to believe both of these statements at the same time. Okay, so here's what we find across the 5 sort of types of claims that we considered. And on the x-axis is people's ratings of whether or not this would, how rational it would be, right? So the rating goes from being highly irrational at 1 to rational at 7. And the first thing to note is that the modal response for everyone for everything is that it would be really irrational. Most people are giving 1s. So people do not like inconsistency in any of these cases. But at the same time, we do see differences across domains. And people are saying that this is more irrational for our sort of fact statements than it is, for instance, for our politics statements, which presumably would encompass cases like the Republican case I just showed you. And so this is, I think, a candidate for another signature that might help differentiate belief types and that we're starting to explore. Okay, so I will wrap up there. I mean, again, just to signal this final point, I mean, I think there's, from my perspective, it's kind of like the early days for this particular program of research, even though it intersects with a lot of work that's already been done in philosophy and in psychology. And I find it really easy to think about and generate predictions in this space if you posit two distinct types of beliefs, but I think really the landscape is probably more like that, and that we're just starting to characterize some of the structure within that space. Thank you.